quick update on what is happening on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict through the day. Images and appeals have been coming in from the people of Ukraine who are asking, where are the NATO forces? Meanwhile, world leaders figuring out what is the next step. Vladimir Putin has indicated that he is willing to come to the negotiation table. This after a conversation with Xi Jinping. But this comes with a rider. The condition seems to be that Ukraine pretty much lays down its arms. Ukraine President Zelensky earlier even called on Putin for a sit down, but it's not clear if these conditions laid down by Putin are acceptable. So it remains a wait-and-watch situation. Meanwhile, from the Indian context, the evacuations continue of Indian nationals out of Ukraine through the various borders, and those processes continue, especially for students. The government has said that it will foot the bill for all of the Indians who need to be evacuated out of the country, which is a big sigh of relief for these people. But we are going to focus this evening on why this conflict, this war, matters to us and why it is likely to impact us in a very real way, in a very tangible way. So crude prices have been on the boil. They've eased down a little since yesterday. Yesterday they touched $105 a barrel. They're about $96, $97 a barrel right now. So some of that has eased, but $97 is not something which you can tolerate easily from the Indian economy perspective. So how is that going to impact us? Let me first go across to my colleague Amit, who's explaining.
As higher crude prices is a reason to worry globally, we try to gauge the possibilities that could lead to a decline in crude prices going forward. So the first possibility is the US lifting sanctions on Iran. Now this wouldn't happen immediately, but over some period of time, if the sanctions are lifted, then Iran could add possibly 1.3 to 1.5 million barrels of crude per day, which could lead to a reduction in crude prices. The second possibility is US itself increasing its production. Now according to experts, the current production is close to 12.2 million barrels of crude, and this could further increase by nearly 1.8 million barrels of crude per day. And this is because US has that much capacity to increase the production. The third possibility is that if OPEC itself increases its production or even is able to meet its production target. Now in the month of January 2022, the OPEC missed its production target by nearly 1 million barrels of crude. Now if even they meet this production target or increase their production target, Brent crude prices could decrease going forward. Now even for India, crude at $100 per barrel is a matter of concern, and that is because nearly 85% of India's crude requirement is imported in the country. Now how does it impact India? Firstly, it increases the inflationary pressure, and if you see, according to Nomura, nearly 10% increase in crude prices increases India's headline inflation by nearly 30 basis points. Along with this, as crude is one of the major raw material and it is used in many industries, the input cost and the cost of production for these industries increases. For namely paint, tire, cement, lubricant manufacturers, for them crude is one of the major raw material and their cost of production increases. Along with this, for an airline, fuel cost is one of the major costs, and hence their cost also increases going forward. Now as India imports nearly 85% of its crude requirement, a $1 per barrel rise in crude prices increases in India's import bill by nearly $2 billion. And lastly, if you see, the current account deficit, that also deteriorates with a rise in crude prices. Now, according to RBI estimates, a $10 per barrel rise in crude prices increases India's annual current account deficit by nearly $12.5 billion.
All right, Dr. Aurodeep Nandi, India economist and Vice President Nomura, with us on the show. Amit Bhandari, Senior Fellow, Energy Investment and Connectivity at Gateway House, joining us today. D.K Joshi, Director and Chief Economist, CRISIL, with us, and Abhishek Kumar, Chief Analytics Officer, Energy Projections, also with us on the show. Welcome to all of you. Dr. Aurodeep, let me begin with your take. Nomura has put out a report which says that India will be the worst hit in Asia. Can you elaborate on that?
Good evening, Tamanna. Well, the reason is actually quite simple, because India is within Asia one of the largest importers of oil. So in any such geopolitical tensions where markets get spooked and oil prices go up, India remains quite vulnerable. So there are a couple of things. One, I think there's this, we need to remember that crude oil prices have been rising even before Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. right? So they've been rising because global travel demand has been picking up. Economies are getting out of COVID. We've had what is known as greenflation, so less investments in fossil fuels. So there are other pressures also on crude oil prices, which has kept it elevated. And then this has been sort of the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. Now, as far as India is concerned, there are two concerns. One, since November, petrol prices have not been risen. So petrol, diesel, LPG prices have been kept constant, despite crude oil prices rising quite sharply by around, or if not over 20% since December levels. And at some point, right, possibly in March, once state elections get over, these prices will have to be passed on through to consumers, right? And so when that happens, you've got that correction that needs to happen. Petrol, diesel prices would go up by as much as 10% month on month. LPG prices are likely to go up. So you've got to absorb that. And then you've got to absorb this
Steve,
new
what's the number?
shock.
What's the number? Because, there are so many other aspects to this on why pump prices have not increased since November. We're in election time, and I refer to 10th March before. So what is the number that needs to increase to sort of catch up to where crude is?
So we estimate that the petrol consumer price index, right, would go up by anywhere around 10% month on month. Over the course of, so this could be staggered, right? So it's not like they're going to just wake up and raise prices in one shot. So you'll have these daily increases of 20, 30 paise possibly, but also it could be like sort of staggered over the course of a couple of months, but we see a rise of around 10% or so, because there is a huge gap currently between the rupee price of crude oil and actually what we are paying at petrol pumps. So there is that, but the caveat in this is maybe the government would like to come in and say, okay, we'll cut excise duties. But that's a two-edged sword, right? Because already, government has cut excise duties by 5 rupees per litre. If I'm not mistaken, that has cost the exchequer around 0.5% of GDP. If the government again comes in and says, all right, crude oil prices have gone up, we are going to cut excise duties further in order to take care of that, that would mean a fiscal hit. Now, if you still want to maintain your fiscal deficit target of 6.4% of GDP, you need to cut down capital expenditure in order to make for this new excess money that you're going to spend around 0.5% of GDP in taking care of a cut in excise duties. So there are really no easy choices as far as this is concerned.
Absolutely. So that would also be partially a political decision on what the final pump prices are. But Amit Bhandari, I want you to explain to us what this means for India in terms of the current preparation we have. We know prices are as high or hovering around the same levels as 2014, but there is a big change in our forex cushion right now. There is a fair amount of cushion that we've given ourselves by these enormous excise duties which have been levied over the last few years. Does that help us a little bit?
Well, I mean, in case of high oil prices, there are 2 or 3 problems India has traditionally faced, and one has been forex, as you rightly pointed out. That is probably not so much of an immediate concern. Inflation, as Aurodeep pointed out, is one issue, partly because of crude oil. And also, I think the rising price of liquefied natural gas because of issues in Europe is going to be a major concern for us. Petroleum is also an input used for urea or fertilizer manufacture. And fertilizer prices, I think, have tripled in the last 1.5 years. So that again is one concern which will definitely be a problem. The thing with these commodities is price goes up in one place, it goes up everywhere else. And we are already witnessing food price inflation, which is, I think, at the highest for at least last 10 years or so. So that is one issue. The other is a longer term problem in the oil market itself. Investment which should go into oil and gas to keep supply at a stable level or mildly rising in lines with demand, that is not happening. And which is why you witness the situation that something happens in Europe and suddenly the price crosses $100 a barrel. We had not witnessed this kind of a market reaction when Saudi Aramco was attacked in 2019.
Yeah.
So the oil market is much tighter than what it used to be. Less investment is going into oil because of the push towards green energy. And India is going to continue to remain dependent on imported oil for a very long time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, going forward next 5 or 6 years, we will face a problem of a tight market and high prices.
So, let's break this down into real impact. And here I come to you, Dr. Joshi, because the question of what this is going to do to inflation. Now, inflation projections by the Reserve Bank for the rest of the year seem to place it in a pretty tolerable range. Does that entire calculation now get appended with what has happened in Russia and Ukraine? What is the real impact we will see on people's lives, their expenses overall?
Well, I think it depends on how much the government passes on to the end consumer. I think that's a decision which they'll have to take. My sense is that they will divide the burden, but they'll take some of the hit on the fiscal side and they'll pass some of it to the end consumer, because eventually I think if they pass it on fully and oil is at 100, I think that's going to push inflation quite high. I think already many industries are facing very high input costs and they have not been able to pass them on to the end consumer. So I think the pressure on inflation will be via the direct impact, the fuel price going up, and the indirect impact via pass through to the rest of the economy. So it can actually it can spoil the arithmetic on inflation. And our expectation with oil at 80 to 85 was 5.2% CPI inflation for 22-23. Obviously, there will be an upside to that, depending on how government decides to pass it on to the end consumer.
So just to contextualize that, again, I come back to you, Mr. Joshi, with where we are with consumer demand and the imperative, because we had this conversation, I think a few days ago, where you stressed about that cushioning is required to really revive consumption in India. This current geopolitical situation can surely not be good news for that aspect.
Well, I think what happens is if your energy bill goes up, I think it hits everyone. I mean, and that is going to reduce your ability to spend on other things. I mean, and this is particularly true for the lower income brackets, where I think the demand from that side is already very weak. I mean, for private consumption. So it will make the recovery of private consumption even more difficult.
Okay, let's come to the question of where oil will move. And Abhishek, let me come to you. Thank you for your patience. Do you see these extremely high trends to continue over time? We already saw cooling off in the last 24 hours, where crude has now dipped, Brent has dipped below 100. What is the kind of pattern you're seeing over the next few days, or is it too difficult to predict at this point?
Well, what I can say is oil prices are already high in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, how high prices will go from here depends on whether sanctions are imposed targeting Russian oil supplies. So as it stands, the current sanctions imposed by the West will have little impact on the Russian economy in the short to medium term. So most sanctions are long-term focused. So what is required is for the international community, including the West, to immediately implement much stringent sanctions to deter the Russian aggression. So there is a balance to be made over here. So the more stringent sanctions you impose, the higher oil prices will go, and especially if you are targeting Russian supplies. So that's going to be a very big concern for all the consumers of oil. Now, I must also say that lip service is cheap and politicians are quite good at it. However, imposing draconian sanctions will be difficult and economically painful for both Russia and the West, and you can also generalize that to rest of the consumers. This is where we need to look while forecasting oil forward. So what could really hurt the Russian aggression is sanctions directly targeting Russian oil and natural gas trade.
Abhishek, what are the mitigating factors that we could see? I mean, there's talk about allowing Iran to supply more oil. Nations like the United States have fairly significant stockpiles. Will they start releasing those? Where does OPEC come into this? Is that conversation going to happen, or will everyone just keep mum and let Putin do his thing?
Well, that's the tricky question, because when we talk about OPEC, so you also need to consider OPEC plus, and Russia is an integral part of OPEC plus, and you also need to consider that Russia is a major supplier of oil as well as natural gas. So if you impose sanctions targeting Russian supplies, then there is a big question how efficiently you can fill that gap. And looking at the trend or the way politicians in the EU have moved so far, they are not very happy imposing such sanctions yet. So most recently we had the EU meeting, and they could not agree on such sanctions targeting supplies. So coming back to alternative supplies, like, you can relax sanctions on Iran, and then over time, they may be able to increase supplies to between 1 million barrels per day to 1.3 million barrels. Now, the numbers vary. There is also a possibility that the US could increase its supplies. But then it's not just the question of increasing supplies, it's also the question of sending all those supplies to the market. So do you really have that kind of transportation capacity that you can bring all those US supplies out of the US throughout the world? And whether US suppliers are ready to increase supplies to those levels. And then also keep that in also we must keep in mind that US shale formations and any oil and gas that you produce from there, those are not the cheapest barrels.
No, absolutely. So, that the takeaway from the West's support right now seems to be that we will do everything to help you, Ukraine, until it starts getting inconvenient for us. So that sort of positions Crude like that. Aurodeep, I want to come back to you just on the aspect of a larger impact of the Indian economy. And you've explained in great detail why India is extremely vulnerable. What can we do? What are the options we have as we enter perhaps a prolonged period of very high crude prices? And what could be the next policy steps that you foresee?
So I think, I think the policy steps out here, none of them are costless, right? So if you want to cut down excise duties at pump level, that's going to increase fiscal deficit. If you want to control fiscal deficit, you need to cut down on capital expenditure. Now, one of the reasons why the budget was fettered quite a lot was because it focused a lot on capital expenditure. So you've got to draw that down. So I mean, it's kind of one of those things where there is limited amount of policy options. But I think the thing that sort of is really interesting in this is what monetary policy is going to do. The RBI has set an inflation projection of 4.5% for FY23. Now that sounds really nice, right? 4.5% is very close to the target of 4%, and they argue that the growth is slowing. So overall, we should be cutting, we should be at least keeping rates where they are. And now, even without all of this, right, we think that inflation this underestimates inflation by anywhere between 1 to 1.3 percentage points. So inflation is possibly going to be closer to 6%. Our number is around 5.8%. And that's not just because of high oil prices. Commodity prices are rising. Yes. Firms are passing on a lot of these costs to consumers, right? We've seen this in auto. We've seen this in telecom. We're seeing this in consumer durables and non-durable companies. Plus, you've got elevated levels of inflation expectations. And so somewhere in the middle of the year, the RBI would then have to be cognizant of the fact that, look, inflation is actually going nowhere close to a 4% target, but in fact is actually inching much higher. which is why we believe that despite the dovish guidance, the central bank is likely to raise rates by as much as 100 basis points this year, with a pivot happening somewhere in June. So I think, managing inflation, so you can't tackle something like oil, but what you can do is tackle the broader pressures that are there in the economy. And I think at some point, in such a situation, if you want to prevent a stagflation kind of situation where growth slows and then your inflation is quite high, the central bank needs to come in and start hiking rates. The other very quick aspect is, in the short term, there are growth drivers. Let's not forget them away. We've got high levels of government spending. We've got the services sector that is reopening, right? We've got strong export growth because global demand seems to be good now. A lot of these factors might start reversing towards the second half of the year. The key ingredient to make this a successful recipe is if private capex in India picks up. Now, the positive side there is that a lot of these companies have deleveraged quite a lot, so their balance sheets are relatively clean. But on the flip side, consumption demand is quite low. The capacity utilization is low. So a lot of these companies won't be interested in making private investment. And we've not seen that pipeline pick up. But if that picks up, then there is hope. So, yes, inflation is going to be high. Yes, there's something on crude oil which you can't really solve at domestic level. But, if the growth cycle sort of remains stable, that could be a positive that could come in. But overall, we are bearish on growth in the second half of 2022.
Okay, so 2022 is definitely proving to be a challenging year on all fronts, and inflation is something once again to watch out for, to worry about. We did a report today about how consumer durable makers are already preparing for another round of price hikes in April, and that's probably going to follow across sectors as well. So watch this space. I want to thank all of you for joining us today and talking about how this conflict actually impacts everyone back home.